We're just a couple of years shy of the 200th anniversary of some Bible nerd called William Webb something or other picking up a gentleman's game played by hooligans and asking which French team would turn up. And from that very day that rugby union football was born, no question has been asked in pubs and or thankless corners of the internet by those who follow it more than this. Who is the best number 10? It's a question so hackneyed we had to invent 1,604 different names for the position just to keep the conversation fresh. And yet, at the minute, that conversation is even more baffling than ever as the rugby world continues to tick along ignoring the obvious facts before them. The open and shut case for the greatest doctor tactics in world rugby. Because the number 1, number 10 on planet Earth right now is England and Leicester Tigers' George Ford. The thumbnail, the title, that also bold statement has no doubt been a bit of a trigger for a handful of you. There are no doubt plenty of you out there who are giving currently the classic, well, he isn't even as good as Marcus Smith, Joe Simmons, Dan Cipriani, Jacob Umanga, Ollie Barkley, Shane Geraghty, Liam Gallagher, Zach Henry, Steve Milo, on which you'd have a fair point. Jordan Crane's 4-year-old son who's already better goal kicking than Bowden Barrett, Ford's younger brother Patrick or Simon or Charlie, whatever he's called, or basically any other flyer from the Premiership. But by a lot of the traditional merits, right, some of you might have a point on a few of those. Does Ford have the raw talent, ability as a rugby athlete, even skill set of someone like Bowden Barrett, Roman Untermack, Finn Russell? No. But that genuinely doesn't matter, because no fly half suits modern rugby better than George Ford. People's impression of Ford is pretty much this, right? He's a sharp playmaker, but he's kind of just Owen Farrell's support act. What he does, anyone could do. Like Danny Cipriani could throw this pass. Marcus Smith could score this try. What he does is nothing special. He's just kind of consistent, I guess. He was just kind of there. But without wanting to be too rude, that's to look at rugby in a very basic, old-fashioned way. Because Ford is far more than his skill set. His play is far more than meets the eye. And I ask you, please, before posting a comment about Andre Pollard, hear me out. So, in order to dig into just why England fans and a lot of rugby watchers in general are sleeping on the pinnacle of pivots, it's worth first explaining the role of an outside glamour hand and how it's changed over the last decade and a bit. Throughout the history of rugby, no shirt can match the sheer prestige of the number 10. Worn by some of the greatest and most famous players in the history of the game, the sheer influence we've seen talented 10s have over entire teams is unparalleled. Over the last 50 years, many of the most famous sides for club and country were direct reflections of who they had at 10. 03 England were great in defence, clinical, impossibly hard-working, and big on kicking, just like Johnny. 1970s Wales were full of flair and sidestepping like Benny and Barry, who shared the shirt across the golden age. The vintage Munster side, who twice conquered Europe, were Ronan O'Gara, a mega bastard who would stand up and fight until he heard the bell. The 3 World Cup winning Springbok sides were all tactically assured and tough as nails with nerves of steel. And the 2011-2015 All Blacks were the most well-rounded side we've ever seen. A team with all the rough edges sanded off in favour of slightly boring perfection, just like old DC. However, rugby is beginning to change. Teams can still be built around their 10s, as Racing or the Crusaders will tell you, and having a good primary ex-lapper is still crucial to being a top tier team. But increasingly, the game has moved beyond looking to one man as a source of identity. In fact, in many ways, if a team's playing well, if a team's good, it's a well-oiled 15 running their patterns correctly. The big rug architect is almost the most replaceable player in the lineup. Look at how Leinster, for instance, play much of their best rugby with Kieran Frawley or any of the endless Byrne brothers at 10 instead of Jim Jam Sexack. So, what's changed? Traditionally, your 10 is the first player to catch the ball when it leaves the ruck. He's the first receiver. But new structures, screen runners, the 1-3-3-1 system and the like have evolved pattern play and now mean the first pass is often going to a forward, looking to buy the 10 or another distributor time on the ball without forcing them to stand 20 metres behind the gain line, as was the case about 8-9 years ago. So what is a first 5 when they're not the first receiver? A very fine case study of this can be found in the club career of one particular Leverhoofer who is frequently mentioned in those virtual pub conversations. My 10 of 2020 Romain Ntamack, an outstanding first-up Charlie for France, yet Ntamack plays the majority of his club rugby for Toulouse in the centre. However, whilst you might find this kind of a weird transition from Test to top 14 tiers, it actually makes a lot of sense because the way France use their 10 is closer to the way Toulouse use their 12 than the Bish Boot Prime itself. Instead, Toulouse regularly field Australian Zach Holmes in position X. Holmes first arrived in France at La Rochelle, where he signed as a utility player, a fullback who could also cover wing or centre. He was not a booty link boy. However, that now vintage La Rochelle side happened to be the furthest extreme I've seen in evolving the 10 position. Instead of a quote-unquote proper fly half, La Rochelle would use Holmes or winger Jeremy Senzel at 10. This might seem insanely French, but it was actually a brilliant bit of maverick design by co-head coach Xavier Garbajosa, who had developed an ambitious 2-3-2-1 system so ornate with so many moving parts, it only really worked if you stripped the role of the fly half right back for fear of otherwise overcomplicating things. No longer running the show, the La Rochelle Johnny First Catcher's job was to select which carrier was in the most space and sometimes to pass at them. That was it. That was everything. Any and all kicking went to the 9, but even then La Rochelle ran almost everything, and so, because that job could be done by anyone, Garbajosa just selected an extra wing, an extra centre, an extra fullback, and put them in the 10 jersey. And had them, they had to do an extra bit of admin, but otherwise they could just play their standard game. Most normal Bosso Slick kicks would be too tempted to try and manage the game, or some other bullshit, so La Rochelle were genuinely better playing someone out of position to fit their system. What idea didn't originate in the southwest of France, and nobody has gone quite as far as they did since. Elements of this idea have dripped down into most modern teams, Toulouse included, as the La Rochelle Extreme has merged with the old idea of a 15 figurehead to create the modern fly half. The wigwag flip-flap position is now essentially a membrane the rest of the team passes through but never stops at. Their job is stuff like this. It's deciding which runners to hit, a la La Rochelle, but still deciding when it's on to kick, when you go wide, when you tighten up, the usual, as well as actually, having to actually do things like give passes and make kicks. There are a handful of exceptions, such as France and Australia, where the man in the 10 jersey is less of a fly half and more of an inside centre, a creative third midfielder. But generally, the backplayer A-Road's job is to manage a marshal, to knit everything together. In most modern game plans, you should be hearing the 10's name a lot in commentary, but probably not that often in punditry, as they bring out the best in the others around them, but shine no spotlight on themselves. They're masterminding the attack, whilst everyone else picks up the actual swords and shields. And no modern fly half plays this role better than George Ford. To get down to the most basic level of explanation, though a team structures in rugby vary wildly, as I've alluded to, you can really neatly divide them into teams that play off 10 and teams that play off 9. Basically, this is just saying, generally, when the side are running a crash ball, who is giving the pass to the guy taking contact? If it's coming from the base of the previous ruck, the team are playing off 9. If there's someone in between, taking the ball and giving a pass to the carrier, they're playing off 10. Playing off 9 is quicker and safer, whereas playing off 10 allows you to hit weak spots in the opposition defence more precisely, but you risk them getting up in your face and knocking you backwards. It's a horses for courses tactical choice. Joe Smith's Ireland and Fabien Gautier's France play almost entirely off 9, whereas Wayne Pivac's Wales play primarily off 10. Eddie Jones's England, however, like to mix it up, trying to vary their game and use the assorted benefits of either system to their advantage. So, knowing England like to switch it up, let's check how they play with Owen Farrell at 10 rather than Ford. It's not so much that England play more off 9 or more off 10 with Fazbot, as they tend to stick to one or the other. For this passage here against Australia, every phase is going through Farrell's hand. He's touching the ball every time. He's choosing every carrier himself. And as you can see, it's hugely effective. Farrell is a really, really good flap hand and continues to pick the best possible runners. For virtually the entire match, until Ford comes on around the 65-minute mark, England are playing off 10. However, against Italy in the Six Nations last year, Farrell, still at 10, they play almost entirely off 9. These are both extreme examples, but Farrell tends to decide on a passage-by-passage basis. If England start playing off 10, they'll generally continue doing so until they lose the ball. Then, when they regain it next, Farrell will decide all over again. This leads to quite binary rugby. You're either doing one thing or the other. It would be easy to suggest that England play more attacking rugby with Ford at 10 and more forward and kicking based rugby with Farrell, but that's an oversimplification. Instead, it's about how and when. Farrell England tends to separate those two as separate ideas. You're either kicking and crashing, or you're attacking. The likes of Pollard, Bigger, Sex Falafel, more often than not also fall into that category. They're capable of it all, but it's like they need to go back to the main menu in order to switch mode. The phenomenal thing about Ford is his ability to integrate all rugby into one seamless game, always with an eye on the bigger picture. England will effortlessly slide from quick to slow, from ruck to kick, with Ford fond of this trick, hiding himself deep in the backline on what looks like an attacking move to give himself more time to find space in the opposition backfield. All this leads to a more cohesive total team. During this passage against Wales, with Ford at 10, England playing 9 phases and switched between playing off 9 and 10 almost every phase. They almost alternate every single time. Now, any 10 can call the ball to himself and vary the play, but Ford is so special because he always seems to know when to do it. And here, having had time to assess from the bench just how Scotland were defending, he proceeds to let the team play almost entirely off 9. He's always lurking, always about, but never once calling the ball out the back to himself. However, with just 90 seconds to go, England 7 points behind, he senses this is the moment. Instead of calling an exit play, he takes the ball himself for the first time and engages the defence and hits Curry, running a great line. And then he calls it to himself a second time, gets it wide, sensing an overlap. However, when England get downfield, they revert back to playing off 9 again. The whole time, Ford just lurking here behind the forwards, never once calling it to himself. He remains an option England aren't using until a second Scotland forget. This here is the first time in the full match Ford calls the ball out the back to himself, despite having been there as an option constantly. Scotland had stopped watching for it. They just focused on each runner, one at a time, and so Ford, having bided his time until it was truly on, can slide through for the try that equalises for England. There are endless examples of him waiting, watching, adjusting to the game in front of him. Credit for this try deserves to go almost entirely to Johnny May, and it will, but the inch that eventually allowed him to take the 30 yards comes from the variety and interplay of Ford. After 10 phases of Ford's job being just simple passes to forwards, he waits until the French defence is compressed enough to pull a trick. With Ford running good lines off him, he fires it instead behind to Daly, who only has to draw his man and put May away down the wing for the try that is eventually really well finished. The examples you're seeing so far are Ford reading the game in front of him and adapting, such as here changing his mind 3 times after assessing a defence in almost seemingly slow motion. He's initially shaping for the wide pass. Watson cuts it off, so he considers going himself, spots that's covered, so flicks it into fullback Freddie Stewart to go over without a finger laid on him. But Ford's incredible knack for undressing a defence doesn't only live in the moment. In fact, I think the most impressive thing about the best fly half in the world is his insane ability to anticipate play. Here, against Argentina in the World Cup, Elliot Daly launches a counter-attack, and England play a couple of quick phases to refine their shape. But let's just go back a second. Ford is stood at first receiver, but after scanning the Argentine defence, he starts to shout at Farrell and points to the spot. Whilst the ruck is taking place, Ford and Farrell switch positions, and Ford hides himself in what appears to be a pod of forwards. Faz and Sinclair settle the crash up, but instead the ball goes back to Ford. With the first group of Pumas drawn in by this, all Ford has to do is fix or take a Desio here, and England have opened Argentina right up, Billy Vanapola making the charge up to the 22. When other players see a numbered up defence, Ford is instead working out in 4 dimensions how to unlock it. In a matter of seconds, he identifies a forward who, if drawn in, will shut the Pumas' drift defence down, realises the way England is set up won't break them down, so reshuffles his ranks, explains the first half of the play to Farrell, so Ford himself can slot in and do the trickier part of the plan personally, rather than trying to communicate the whole piece to other players. Just a few minutes later in that same game, England run this nice set move to put Johnny May away down the wing. Then Ford steps in to have a word with Marler and Curry, the 2 forwards. And just check Ford's eye line. As he's talking to them, he's looking at this gap here, just outside the first burst of Argentine defenders. And where does Marler eventually carry? That's right! He adjusts his line and heads into that exact space. Had Marler carried here as he was intending, these 2 players would still be in the game. Instead, Ford has subtly reduced the Argentine ranks before calling it then quick ball to himself. The whole time he watches Kramer until the big lad eventually commits and he throws it out the back, letting May once again right through, coming down just short of the line. England then play like 10 phases or something ridiculous on the line, whilst Ford waits patiently, so patiently. Eventually, he spots it and he shouts. It's not the most accurate pass in the world, but it doesn't have to be because it's quick enough not to matter. He gives Daly the time he needs to fade on the outside and over for the try. When you watch a game back for the second or third time, I certainly find this, you can often start to spot things Ford is plotting 2 or 3 phases in advance. As England spread this quick ball wide, Ford recognises he's not needed, so drops out and takes position to analyse the defence before it's even set itself. He identifies 2 key spots in the Irish defence. First, Bundyaki here, the man who leads their line speed. Secondly, Conor Murray and CJ Sander here together. If England are to open Ireland up, they'll need to take out all 3 of these players. So Ford figures they can do that in 2 phases. He calls May to loop him as Itoje carries. Johnny May hides himself in this pod as Ford invites a forward to hit up in between Murray and Sander. But the number 8 makes an excellent tackle, meaning Murray isn't drawn in. If he had been, England would have been unleashing 4 runners at 2 defenders in 10 metres of space, with May having completed his jog round from the far touchline. Curry does manage to spin out of Conway's tackle, but ultimately it only leads to a penalty rather than the try Ford so nearly masterminded. There are plenty of smart 0.55 backs out there, but the thing that really sets Ford apart is his sheer patience. I'm not sure there's another standoff worldwide who is as willing to go long stretches of a game without touching the ball as Ford. I mean, here he spots Adams has turned his back and actively steps away, pointing and telling Youngs to ignore him and throw the missed pass to May. However, Youngs obviously only has eyes for the touchline and sends a kick through to his one true love. In a position often overrun by ego, Ford is more interested in getting the ball over the line than through his hands. It's all about the common goal, and hence he never really loses form because his play has nothing to do with confidence. Ford is a player who never drops on the basics. Here he fades round late to the short side, spotting Argentina a number short. Then, knowing where May is, his eyes are always on Erdopageta, the Argentine defender. For anyone who says they watch these videos to help with their own rugby, this should be textbook. Take notes here. You'd be amazed how many players at pro level can't execute a 2-on-1 because they're eyeing up their teammate rather than watching the defender's body language and waiting for the second they close themselves off to give the pass, which is exactly what Ford does. Now, I've spent so much of the last month poring over Ford that at one point this video would have been over 40 minutes of OTT analysis on his ability to discern and disable an opposition defence in real time without even touching on the things that would have been the whole video if I've been making this about Bodie or Finn or whoever else you might want to suggest. But Ford's passing is pretty spot on. His eye for the gap isn't that of Barrett, but it's rather that of a coach. He looks for holes in the defence rather than space he can attack. And then we have his kicking game, which I haven't even mentioned. After coming off the bench against Australia, we saw Ford give a very different performance to his one against Scotland, and yet exactly the same in that he'd identified every weak spot while sat on the sidelines and proceeded to press the relevant buttons. Just like he does in attack, the secret to Ford's kicking game is its variety and ability to surprise. Here, he shapes the kick, spots the winger dropping back, begins to back out of it, but when Carreras notices this and starts to second guess himself, Ford does drop it on the boot and find space in behind. And, I'll let Ron Nugent here explain just what he did for Daly to score against Ireland.
It looked like they were shaping the kick cross field. Instead, it was a little dink over the top. Ireland dallied once more and Daly dived in.
His skill set is so well-rounded, no part stands out, and that's kind of to the detriment of his reputation in pub debates, but in no way to any team he plays for. There used to be these frequent arguments that his defence was poor, but that just isn't true, right? At 96%, he had the best tackle success rate of any flight half in the 2019 World Cup. And the other phrase frequently spouted about Ford was that he was great on the front foot, but no good on the back. Now, his continued performances for Leicester prove otherwise, but that's still missing the point. George Ford creates the front foot like no other player in world rugby. A large part of why Ford is so valuable is because he is uniquely talented at creating momentum in a team. I used this passage with Farrell to show earlier what a capable attacking 10 he is, but just compare the way Farrell here, or say Jumbo Wasp Sex Crime here, performs drop-offs and crash balls to Ford in any of the clips you're seeing now. Playing flat or deep to engage defence is something that largely died alongside Dan Parks' career, but George Ford is exceptional at nonetheless engaging a defence and, more importantly, knowing which parts of it to hit to open up. He's the king of working out how many phases it's going to take to get them over the line and what phases they're going to require. I previously highlighted the way Peter Steph Toy really targeted Ford in the World Cup final, but that's part of Ford's job, and when he does exceptionally well, drawing in defenders who are hitting him instead of matching the carrier on the gain line. The things Ford does are things any of the quote-unquote more talented players, the Bodies and Finns of the world, could do, but they don't. George Ford is a chess master who is always playing moves ahead, yet able to adapt to whatever's in front of him. He's digging a hole in the prison wall for jackhammer, but also always alert to the guards leaving their keys lying around. Because the things he does best aren't about him. So many viewers miss just what a phenomenon we're currently witnessing on the international stage. But he's so capable, so fresh, so talented, and for Six Nations and then a subsequent likely Lions tour coming up, has such an opportunity to show just why he is the man who, if there's any justice in the world, will finally end the virtual and pub-side debates, at least for a little while, by being the best fly half in the world. Happy Six Nations Week. We're almost round to the most wonderful time of the year. That was a video that I've been wrestling with for a very long time. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked it. As I said, there was one cut that was almost about 40 minutes long. So be thankful you didn't see that. Be thankful I managed to wrestle it down somehow to below 20 minutes. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the support the channel on Patreon. It's a huge help in me be able to, put so much time into a video like this, be able to stop and re-watch every game Forge played for 2 years. And also I've got a podcast going on if you want to have a look at that. This week we interview Connor Trainer, Canada international in 7s and 15s, talking about the time he once scored 2 tries against the All Blacks. So please, go and listen to that. There's links elsewhere. There's loads more on the channel. There's going to be loads more when the Six Nations begins next week. See you then.